I used to think Seth Kane hated me for no reason. Not in the dramatic, movie villain kind of way. Nothing that obvious. He just had this way of looking at me like I'd personally ruined his day by existing near him. Every meeting, every team call, every stupid office happy hour, same thing. Short answers. Flat tone. Zero patience. If I made a suggestion, Seth would find a flaw in it before I even finished speaking. If I was 5 minutes late to something, he'd glance at his watch like he was documenting evidence for a future trial. And the worst part? Nobody else seemed to notice. Dude, Seth's just intense. My coworker Olivia told me once while we were stuck reorganizing presentation files at 7 p.m., he's like that with everyone. No, I muttered. He definitely saved something special for me. She laughed. I didn't. Because after 8 months of working together, I knew the difference between someone being difficult and someone specifically disliking you. Seth disliked me, which is why getting assigned to a 3-day business trip alone with him felt like a personal attack from the universe. I found out on a Thursday morning. My manager leaned against my desk with the kind of expression people use right before ruining your week. So, she said carefully, small change of plans. That sentence is never followed by happiness. The Denver client moved the presentation up. We need 2 people there Monday morning. I already knew where this was going. You and Seth are the best options. I stared at her. You're joking. Noah. No, seriously. That's funny. She crossed her arms. You two are the strongest team we have. Pretty sure Seth would rather eat drywall. She ignored that. Flight leaves Sunday night. Hotels already booked. Then she walked away before I could argue more. I immediately opened Slack. Noah. Apparently we're going to Denver together. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Seth. I know. That was it. No complaint. No sarcasm. No passive-aggressive comment. Honestly, that somehow made it worse. The entire rest of the week felt tense. Not openly tense. Seth was too controlled for that. But every interaction felt sharpened somehow. Like he was hyper-aware of me. Friday afternoon, we ended up alone in a conference room finalizing slides. Rain hammered against the windows while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Seth sat across from me in a dark gray sweater, sleeves pushed to his forearms, eyes fixed on his laptop. You reordered section 4, he said without looking up. It flows better. It flowed fine before. I sighed. Okay, well now it flows better fine. His mouth twitched. Actually twitched. I stared at him. Was that almost a smile? No, that was definitely a smile. You're imagining things. But he looked away too quickly afterward. That stuck with me. Because for the first time since I'd met him, Seth didn't look irritated. He looked nervous. And suddenly I realized something unsettling. I had absolutely no idea who Seth Kane actually was outside of work. Sunday night came too fast. Airports always make me feel vaguely existential. Too much stale coffee, delayed flights, and people dragging emotional baggage behind them in every possible sense. Seth was already at the gate when I arrived. Of course he was. Dark jacket, black carry-on, headphones around his neck, looking painfully put together for a man voluntarily flying coach on a Sunday evening. He glanced up when he saw me approaching. You're late. I checked my phone. I'm 7 minutes early. You cut things close. You sound like my father. That explains a lot. I stopped walking. Okay, wow. His expression stayed perfectly neutral, but I caught it again, that tiny, almost smile. What the hell was happening? The flight itself was awkward in the most specific way possible because our company had booked us seats together. Not across the aisle. Not separated by civilized emotional distance. Together. I took the window seat. Seth sat beside me, shoulders tense immediately like proximity itself stressed him out. For the first hour, neither of us spoke much. I watched clouds outside the window while Seth worked on his laptop with terrifying concentration. Then turbulence hit. Not dramatic turbulence. Just enough sudden shaking to make the plane dip hard once. I hate flying. Not casually dislike. Actually hate. My hand tightened around the armrest automatically. And Seth noticed. You okay? He asked quietly. I forced a laugh. Love hurtling through the sky in a metal tube. Huge fan. You're afraid of flying? No, I lied instantly. Another rough patch shook the plane. I closed my eyes briefly. Beside me, Seth was quiet for a second before saying, softer now. You can talk if you want. I blinked at him. What? Distraction helps. That didn't sound sarcastic. Or irritated. Or mocking. It sounded kind. Which completely threw me off balance. You offering emotional support right now? I asked carefully. Don't make it weird. Too late. But somehow, despite myself, I relaxed a little. We ended up talking for the next hour. Not about work. About random things. Movies. Terrible airport food. Why Denver apparently has the most confusing weather on Earth. And the more Seth talked, the stranger I felt. Because this version of him, this calm, dryly funny, surprisingly attentive version, I'd never met him before. At one point, I laughed at something he said, and he looked at me in this startled way like he wasn't used to being the reason for it. That feeling stayed with me long after the plane landed. By the time we got to the hotel, it was close to midnight. The lobby smelled like coffee and polished wood. I was exhausted, running entirely on caffeine and travel irritation. Seth handled check-in while I leaned against the counter half asleep. Then the receptionist smiled apologetically. So there's been a small issue with the reservation. Of course there had. Seth's posture immediately stiffened. What kind of issue? We only have one king room available tonight. Silence. I straightened slowly. Excuse me. The hotel is overbooked because of a conference. I looked at Seth. Seth looked at me. And for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely horrified. Honestly, same. I wish I could say we handled the hotel situation like mature professionals. We didn't. There's seriously no other room? I asked for the third time while the receptionist typed uselessly on her keyboard. I'm very sorry, sir. Seth rubbed his forehead slowly like he was developing a migraine in real time. One room, he repeated flatly. One king bed, she confirmed. The silence afterward felt deeply personal. Finally, Seth exhaled. Fine. I turned toward him immediately. Fine. It's midnight, Noah. Right? But have you considered that you hate me? That earned me a full look. I do not hate you. The answer came too fast. Too automatic. And something about that made my stomach do a weird little flip I immediately chose to ignore. The elevator ride up was painfully quiet. Not angry quiet. Worse. Hyper-aware quiet. The kind where you suddenly notice everything. How close someone is standing. How tired their eyes look. How good they smell after a 10-hour travel day for absolutely no reason. I blamed the lack of sleep. The room itself was objectively nice. Huge windows. Soft lighting. One bed sitting directly in the center like a threat. I dropped my bag near the desk immediately. I call floor. Seth looked offended. You are not sleeping on the floor. Wow. Look at you pretending to care about my spine. He set his suitcase down carefully. Noah. What? You're taking the bed. I blinked. You're serious? Yes. And where exactly are you sleeping? I'll figure it out. I looked around the room dramatically. Interesting. I don't see a second dimension available. A pause. Then Seth sighed heavily. We can share the bed like adults. I stared at him. He stared back with the exhausted expression of a man already regretting every life decision that led him here. And honestly, something about seeing Seth visibly flustered was becoming dangerously entertaining. Relax, I said finally. I don't bite. His eyes flicked toward me for half a second. That's not the concern. The room suddenly felt very warm. I laughed too quickly. Okay. Weird thing to say. Seth looked like he wanted to launch himself through the window. Interesting. Very interesting. We got ready for bed in awkward shifts like divorced parents sharing custody of a bathroom. I changed first. Then Seth disappeared into the bathroom, while I tried very hard not to think about the fact that we were about to sleep in the same bed. Which was stupid. We were adults. This was normal. Technically. Still, when Seth walked out in dark sweatpants and a black t-shirt, my brain briefly stopped functioning. Because outside the office, without the sharp posture and constant tension, he looked unfairly attractive. Annoyingly attractive. The kind of attractive that makes you irritated on principle. He froze slightly when he noticed me staring. What? Nothing. You're doing the face. What face? The one where you're clearly thinking something unhelpful. I grinned. You know me so well. His expression did that tiny, almost smile thing again before he climbed into the opposite side of the bed carefully, like sudden movements might kill us both. The lights went off. Darkness settled between us. For about 2 minutes, neither of us moved. Then, you snore? Seth asked quietly. I scoffed. Absolutely not. Good. You? No. Another pause. Then, you really thought I hated you? I turned slightly toward his voice. What else was I supposed to think? Seth was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Finally, I'm not good with people. That's your defense. It's the truth. I stared up at the ceiling. It felt personal, I admitted. Beside me, I heard him shift slightly against the sheets. It wasn't supposed to. Something tightened strangely in my chest. His voice sounded different in the dark, less controlled, more honest. Then why are you like that with me? I asked softly. Another silence. Longer this time. Too long. And then Seth said, very quietly, because you make me nervous. My entire brain short-circuited. I turned toward him immediately, even though I could barely make out his face in the dark. What? I should not have said that. No. Actually, I think you definitely should explain that immediately. A breath of laughter escaped him, tired and rough and real. I don't know how to act around you, he admitted. My pulse started climbing for absolutely no acceptable reason. Seth, you're loud, he continued softly. And confident. Everyone likes you. You walk into a room and immediately belong there. I blinked into the darkness. Nobody had ever described me like that before. And somehow, he said, quieter now, you always know exactly what to say to get under my skin. That sounds less romantic than you think. I'm aware. I laughed before I could stop myself. And Seth laughed too. Actually laughed. The sound shocked me a little because I realized I'd never heard it properly before. Not office polite amusement. Not restrained professionalism. Real laughter. God, who was this man? You know, I murmured. This is probably the longest conversation we've ever had without you criticizing my existence. You color-coded an entire client spreadsheet with 6 different shades of green. It was visually effective. It was psychotic. I grinned into the darkness. Then another silence settled between us. But this one felt different. Softer. Comfortable. Dangerously comfortable. Eventually, I yawned hard enough to interrupt my own thoughts. You should sleep, Seth said quietly. You too. Neither of us moved for a second. Then, very carefully, Seth said, for what it's worth, I never hated you. Something about the sincerity in his voice hit me harder than it should have. Because suddenly all I could think about was how much easier it would have been if he actually had hated me. Instead, lying beside him in the dark hotel room, I was starting to realize something much more dangerous. I wanted Seth to like me. I woke up before Seth did. At least, I think I did. For a few seconds I just lay there, disoriented and warm, staring at the pale morning light bleeding through the hotel curtains. Then I became aware of 2 things simultaneously. 1. Seth was very close. 2. At some point during the night, we had apparently drifted toward each other in our sleep. Not cuddling. Nothing dramatic. But close enough that his arm was resting against mine beneath the blanket, solid and warm and very much real. My entire body immediately went rigid. Oh, this was bad. Because now that I was awake enough to process it, I could also process the fact that Seth looked unfairly good half asleep. His hair was slightly messy. His face softer without that constant tension between his eyebrows. His breathing slow and even. He looked peaceful, and somehow that affected me more than if he'd looked perfect. I should have moved. Instead, like an idiot, I stayed completely still for another few seconds just looking at him. Then Seth opened his eyes. Direct eye contact. Immediate awareness. I watched consciousness hit him in real time. His gaze flicked down briefly, probably noticing how close we were before returning to mine. Neither of us moved. Morning, I said carefully. Seth blinked once. Morning. His voice sounded rough from sleep. That did absolutely nothing good for me. Then, very slowly, Seth pulled his arm back like he was trying not to make the moment weird, which obviously made it 10 times weirder. I sat up too fast. Right? Cool. Normal. Very normal. Extremely professional business trip behavior. At that, Seth actually smiled into the pillow. A real smile. Relaxed. Sleepy. And honestly, that might have been the exact moment my situation became dangerous. Because suddenly I understood something horrible. Seth wasn't cold. He wasn't mean. He wasn't impossible to read. He'd just been holding himself back the entire time. The realization followed me all morning. While we got coffee downstairs. While we walked to the client's office through freezing Denver wind. While Seth adjusted his coat sleeve beside me during the elevator ride up. I couldn't stop noticing things now. The way he always opened doors automatically without thinking about it. The way he listened completely when someone spoke. The way his voice dropped lower when he was focused. It was deeply inconvenient. The presentation itself went smoothly. Actually, more than smoothly. Seth and I worked ridiculously well together once we stopped acting like enemies. At one point during the meeting, I made a joke after a slide transition glitched on screen. The clients laughed, and Seth looked at me with this brief expression that almost seemed fond. Fond. I nearly lost my train of thought completely. Afterward, the clients insisted on taking us to dinner. By the time we finally escaped the restaurant, it was dark outside and lightly snowing. I shoved my hands into my pockets immediately. I can't feel my face. You said that 10 minutes ago. And it's still true. Seth glanced sideways at me. You didn't bring gloves? I didn't expect the air to physically attack me. He stopped walking. I turned back toward him. What? Without a word, Seth pulled one glove off and held it out toward me. I stared at him. You're giving me your glove? You're dramatic when cold. That's because I'm dying. You're not dying. Debatable. His mouth twitched again. Then he stepped closer and took my wrist before I could react properly. Just for a second. Just enough to press the glove into my hand himself. Warm fingers. Cold air. Direct eye contact. And suddenly my heartbeat was doing deeply embarrassing things. There, Seth said quietly. Something about the way he looked at me right then felt dangerous. Not accidental. Not uncertain. Aware. I swallowed hard. Thanks. No problem. But neither of us stepped away immediately. Snow drifted slowly around us under the streetlights while the city moved quietly in the background. And for one insane second, it genuinely felt like something out of a romance movie. Which was ridiculous. This was Seth. Seth, who corrected my grammar in emails. Seth, who once sent me a 4-paragraph explanation about font consistency. Seth, who supposedly made me nervous because I was too loud. And yet standing there in the snow with him looking at me like that, I suddenly understood exactly why he got nervous around me. Because I was starting to feel it too. The walk back to the hotel was quieter afterward. Not awkward, just charged. Every accidental brush of our shoulders felt noticeable now. Every glance lasted slightly too long. By the time we got back to the room, my chest felt tight with awareness. Seth loosened his tie the second the door shut behind us. You did well today, he said. I blinked. That sounded dangerously close to a compliment. It was. You feeling okay? Noah. What? You were good. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I looked at him for a second too long. And Seth noticed. Of course he noticed. The air shifted again. Subtle, but real. Neither of us moved. Then Seth said quietly, You're staring. You make that difficult not to do lately. The second the words left my mouth, silence crashed into the room. My own brain immediately screamed at me. Abort mission. Evacuate. Fake your death. But Seth didn't look away. If anything, he looked more focused now. What does that mean? He asked softly. I should have joked. Deflected. Done literally anything smart. Instead, I said the truth. I don't know what's happening between us. Seth's throat moved when he swallowed. Neither do I. His voice was barely above a whisper now. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Then Seth took one slow step closer. Not enough to touch me. Enough to make my pulse spike instantly. Noah, he said quietly. Tell me if I'm misunderstanding this. I couldn't breathe properly for a second. Because for the first time since I'd met him, Seth wasn't guarded at all. He looked terrified. And hopeful. At the same time. I don't remember who moved first. Later, I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to figure it out whether it was him stepping closer or me forgetting how to step back. Either way, suddenly Seth was standing right in front of me. Close. Close enough that I could see the tiny scar near his jaw I'd somehow never noticed before. Close enough that the tension in his expression felt almost physical. Noah, he said again, quieter this time. And the thing was, Seth always sounded controlled. Even angry, he sounded controlled. Even nervous, restrained. But right then, he sounded wrecked. Like he'd been holding something in for way too long. I swallowed hard. You're definitely not misunderstanding. His eyes closed briefly. Not dramatically. Just one small second of relief. Then he laughed once under his breath, almost disbelieving. You have no idea how long I've been trying not to do this. My heart nearly stopped. What does that mean exactly? I asked carefully. Seth looked at me for a long moment before answering. It means, he said slowly, that the first week you started at the company, you walked into a meeting 20 minutes late carrying 3 coffees and somehow convinced everyone you were charming instead of irresponsible. I blinked. Okay. And then you sat beside me, he continued, and whispered commentary through the entire presentation because you were bored. A grin tugged at my mouth automatically. You were bored too. I know. And you still hated me? I did not hate you. You were extremely committed to the performance. That finally pulled a real laugh out of him again. God, I was becoming addicted to making Seth laugh. Dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Then his expression softened slightly. You made me nervous from the beginning, he admitted quietly. Something warm twisted painfully in my chest. Why? Seth looked almost frustrated by the question. Because you're easy with people, he said. Because everyone gravitates toward you naturally. Because you say whatever's in your head without overthinking it. That sounds like a criticism. It's envy. The honesty of that hit me harder than I expected. I stared at him, and suddenly so many things started clicking into place. The tension, the staring, the weird sharpness whenever I joked with other coworkers. The constant distance that somehow felt too deliberate to be accidental. Oh no. Seth, I said slowly. Were you avoiding me because you had a crush on me? He looked genuinely offended by the phrasing. I'm 32 years old, Noah. That is not an answer. A pause. Then, very flatly, yes. I laughed immediately. Not because it was funny, because I physically didn't know what else to do with the sudden, overwhelming rush of adrenaline in my body. Seth looked horrified. Why are you laughing? I'm sorry, I managed. This is insane. You think this is easy for me? No. I think you've apparently been suffering in silence for months like a Victorian man with tuberculosis. That broke him. Seth laughed so hard, he actually looked away for a second, shaking his head. And something inside me melted completely at the sight. Because this man, this tense, careful, impossible man had apparently been carrying feelings around alone this entire time. While I thought he couldn't stand me. That's really what you thought? He asked eventually, quieter now. That you hated me? Yes. His expression shifted immediately, like the idea genuinely bothered him. Noah, he said softly, I notice everything about you. My breath caught. You walk too fast when you're stressed. You tap your fingers against coffee cups when you're thinking. You pretend to be confident when someone says something that actually hurts your feelings. I couldn't speak. Because those weren't casual observations. Those were the kind of details you only notice when you're looking at someone constantly. Seth stepped a little closer again. And every time you smiled at me, he admitted quietly, I forgot how to act like a normal person. The room felt unbearably still. My pulse hammered so hard it was almost painful. You are really bad at flirting, I whispered. I know, but weirdly effective. At that, his eyes flicked briefly to my mouth. The movement was tiny, barely noticeable. Still, every nerve in my body reacted instantly. And suddenly the air between us changed completely. No more pretending this was hypothetical. No more confusion about what this was. Seth saw it too. I could tell from the way his breathing shifted slightly. From the way he looked at me now careful, intense, waiting. Noah, he said softly, I don't want to make this complicated. You mean more complicated? A faint smile. Right. Then silence again. But this silence felt fragile somehow. Like one wrong movement would shatter it. I should have stepped back. Probably should have said we needed boundaries or professionalism or literally anything responsible. Instead I asked, have you wanted to kiss me this whole trip? Seth stared at me. Then, after one long second, yes. Immediate full-body reaction. Catastrophic. And you? He asked quietly. I laughed softly under my breath because there was no point pretending anymore. Seth, I admitted, I think I've wanted that since the airport. Something vulnerable flashed across his face then. Not fear exactly. More like disbelief. Like he genuinely hadn't expected this to happen. Then very carefully, Seth lifted one hand toward me. Slow enough for me to stop him. Gentle enough to make my chest ache. His fingers brushed lightly against my jaw. And just that tiny bit of contact was enough to make my heartbeat completely lose control. You know, he murmured softly. This is probably a terrible idea. Absolutely. Neither of us moved away. And honestly, that felt like the answer already. Seth kissed me like he was trying very hard not to. Which, weirdly, made it worse. Because the second it happened, the second his hand stayed against my jaw, and he leaned in that last inch, all that careful control cracked just enough for me to feel how badly he wanted it. And apparently that completely ruined me. It wasn't rushed. Wasn't dramatic. Just warm and careful and devastatingly real. For one perfect second my brain went totally silent. Then Seth pulled back slightly like he'd remembered gravity existed again. We were still standing absurdly close together. Neither of us speaking. You okay? He asked quietly. I stared at him. You cannot ask me that immediately after that. A surprised laugh escaped him. God, there it was again. That softer version of Seth nobody else got to see. I'm serious, he said. I know. I swallowed hard. I'm just trying to recover psychologically. His thumb brushed lightly once against my jaw before he seemed to realize he was still touching me. He pulled his hand back immediately, which I hated instantly. The shift in expression told me Seth noticed that too. Dangerous. Very dangerous. We should probably talk about this, he said carefully. Counterpoint, I replied. What if we simply panic instead? That earned another laugh. Then his expression softened again in a way that made my chest ache. You do that, he said quietly. Joke when you're overwhelmed. I blinked. See, he added softly. You're doing it now. The fact that he noticed things like that about me felt weirdly intimate. More intimate, somehow, than the kiss itself. I looked away first. And honestly, that might have been the first time Seth Kane had ever won anything between us. The silence stretched comfortably after that. Not awkward, not uncertain, just stunned. Like neither of us fully knew what to do now that the thing between us was finally real. Eventually, I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed before my legs gave out from adrenaline. Seth stayed standing for another second before sitting beside me carefully, leaving exactly enough space not to overwhelm me, which somehow overwhelmed me anyway. You know what's crazy? I murmured. What? I spent almost a year being emotionally attacked by a man who apparently just had a crush on me. Seth sighed heavily. I was not attacking you. You sent back my quarterly report with tracked comments. It had formatting issues. You wrote disturbing use of spacing. It was disturbing. I laughed so hard I nearly tipped sideways. Seth smiled helplessly at me. And there it was again. That look. Not guarded. Not tense. Not careful. Fond. I suddenly understood why this felt so intense so quickly. Because whatever this was, it hadn't started tonight. It had been building quietly underneath every sharp conversation and every stolen glance for months. Neither of us had realized we were already halfway in. You know what really gets me? I said eventually. Seth glanced over. What? You could have just been nice to me. His expression immediately turned horrified. I was trying. I stared at him. Seth, I bought you coffee. You threw it onto my desk and walked away. I panicked. That is genuinely the least smooth thing I've ever heard. His face actually reddened slightly. Seth Kane, blushing. I was never recovering from this. You're enjoying this way too much, he muttered. Oh, absolutely. This is the best day of my life. That made him shake his head, smiling despite himself. Then the smile faded slowly. Not badly, just thoughtful. Noah, he said quietly. The tone immediately shifted something in me. Yeah. His gaze held mine for a second before he spoke again. I don't want this to become something weird when we go home. My chest tightened slightly. Reality. Right. We worked together. Shared meetings. Shared projects. Shared approximately 12,000 awkward future interactions. I know, I admitted softly. Seth leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. I mean it, he said. I'm not interested in pretending this didn't happen. The sincerity in his voice hit me hard, because suddenly I realized something important. Seth wasn't casual about anything. Not his work. Not his feelings. Not me. And for some reason, that made me even more nervous. What are you interested in then? I asked quietly. He looked at me immediately. Direct. Certain. You. No hesitation. No joking. Just the truth. The air left my lungs in one painful second. Seth must have seen something change in my expression because his own softened instantly afterward. You don't have to answer that right now, he added gently. That's unfortunate, I said weakly. Because my answer is definitely also you. For 1 second, Seth just looked at me. Then he covered his eyes briefly with one hand like I'd personally overwhelmed him. Oh my God, I laughed softly. You're actually shy. I am not shy. You absolutely are. I dislike vulnerability. That's just emotionally intelligent wording for shy. He dropped his hand and gave me a look that absolutely would have intimidated me yesterday. Now I just wanted to kiss him again, which was deeply inconvenient timing. Seth seemed to notice the exact moment that thought crossed my mind. His gaze flicked briefly to my mouth again, and suddenly the room felt too quiet, too warm. Neither of us moved. Then Seth said softly, "You're staring again. You keep being distracting." A pause. Then, quieter. "So are you." That did something catastrophic to my nervous system. I looked at him for a long second. Really looked at him. At the tension he still carried even now. at the carefulness, at the way he kept watching my reactions like this mattered more than he wanted to admit. And suddenly, I understood the truth. Seth hadn't been avoiding me because he didn't feel anything. He'd been avoiding me because he felt too much. I barely slept that night. Not because anything dramatic happened after that conversation. Honestly, that was the problem. Nothing felt rushed between us. No chaos. No impulsive decisions. No awkward regret. Just Seth sitting beside me in the quiet hotel room, looking at me like I mattered to him in a way that felt terrifyingly real. At some point around 2 in the morning, we finally stopped talking. Not because we ran out of things to say, because exhaustion eventually won. This time when we got into bed, the space between us felt completely different. Not tense. Aware. Every movement registered instantly. Every accidental brush of fabric felt noticeable. I stared up at the ceiling for a while, trying to slow my heartbeat down. Beside me, Seth shifted slightly. "You awake?" he asked softly into the darkness. Unfortunately, a quiet laugh. Then silence again. And then, after a second, "Can I tell you something honestly?" I turned slightly toward his voice. "Depends how emotionally devastating it is." "I'm serious." That immediately made me nervous. "Okay." Seth exhaled quietly. "When I realized I liked you," he admitted, "I genuinely considered asking to be transferred to another department." I blinked into the darkness. "What?" "I thought distance would fix it. That is the most Seth solution imaginable." "I know." I stared at him, stunned. "You like me that much?" A pause. "Yes." The honesty of it hit me right in the chest. Because suddenly all those months at work looked different in retrospect. Every tense meeting, every clipped response, every moment his attention seemed locked onto me even when he acted annoyed. "God, you know what's horrible?" I murmured. "What?" "I probably would have flirted with you immediately if you weren't acting like you wanted me dead." That actually made Seth laugh softly beside me. "I know. You know? You flirt with people when you're comfortable." The fact that he'd noticed that made warmth spread painfully through me again. "You really do pay attention to everything." Silence for a second. Then Seth said quietly, "Only with you." "Yeah." That one nearly killed me. I rolled onto my back again dramatically. "I need you to stop saying things like that before my ego becomes medically dangerous." "You already have an inflated ego. You're obsessed with me." "I'm aware." The ease of that answer made me go completely still. Because there it was again. That terrifying sincerity. Seth didn't say things casually. And somehow that made every quiet admission feel enormous. Eventually, exhaustion dragged us both under. The next morning felt strangely normal, which honestly should have concerned me more. I woke up to the sound of the shower running and sunlight pouring through the curtains. For one blissfully disoriented second, I forgot everything. Then I noticed Seth's phone charging beside the bed, his jacket hanging over the chair, the second coffee already sitting on the nightstand next to me, and my stomach immediately flipped. The bathroom door opened a minute later, steam curling out behind Seth as he walked back into the room, adjusting the sleeves of his shirt. He stopped when he saw me awake. "Morning." "God, that voice." "Hi," I answered intelligently. His eyes flicked toward the untouched coffee beside me. "I got yours already." "You remembered my order?" A faint pause. "Yes." "Right." Of course he had. I took the coffee slowly, still watching him. "You know," I said carefully, "you're being suspiciously sweet for someone who spent 8 months psychologically terrorizing me over spreadsheet formatting." That was constructive criticism. That was warfare. Seth smiled slightly while buttoning his cuff. And suddenly the room felt domestic in a way that completely short-circuited my brain. This was bad. Catastrophically bad. Because I could already feel myself getting attached. The realization followed me downstairs, into the elevator, all the way through checkout. Seth handled the hotel bill while I stood beside him, trying not to think too hard about how naturally we'd slipped into each other's space. At one point, his hand brushed lightly against my lower back while moving around me near the counter. Tiny contact. Barely there. Still enough to send warmth straight through my chest. Seth noticed my reaction immediately. Of course he did. His expression shifted slightly softer somehow before he pulled his hand back carefully. Not rejecting. Respectful. That somehow affected me even more. The drive to the airport was quieter than before. Not uncomfortable. Just thoughtful. Like both of us were starting to understand this trip had changed something bigger than either of us expected. At security, I got pulled aside for a random bag check because the universe enjoys humiliating me personally. This is profiling against attractive people, I informed the TSA agent. Sir, Seth, standing 10 feet away, actually covered his face briefly like he was trying not to laugh. You are deeply embarrassing, he informed me once I got my bag back. And yet you're still in love with me. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Silence. I froze immediately. Seth stopped walking. People moved around us in every direction while my nervous system fully left my body. Okay, wow. I started rapidly. That was a joke. Not a joke. Just you know what? Actually, maybe let me die here. But Seth was just looking at me, completely still. And suddenly his expression changed in a way I hadn't seen before. Not nervous. Not guarded. Open. Noah, he said quietly. The way he said my name made my pulse stumble instantly. Then, very softly, I think I might be. Everything inside me stopped. The airport noise faded into background static. I just stared at him. Because Seth said it so simply. Like it scared him. Like it relieved him. At the same time. And the terrifying thing was, part of me already knew I was falling too. The flight home should have felt awkward after that. Objectively, it should have been unbearable. Instead, it felt fragile. Like both of us understood something important had shifted, and neither of us wanted to break it by moving too fast. Seth and I sat beside each other again on the plane. This time, though, the silence between us wasn't cold. It was full. His shoulder brushed mine once while he adjusted his seatbelt. Neither of us moved away. I stared out the window mostly because looking directly at Seth for too long had started causing legitimate psychological damage. Because now every small thing mattered. The way he looked at me before speaking. The way his attention stayed fixed on me completely when I talked. The way he kept unconsciously leaning closer. At one point during the flight, I caught him watching me. Not subtly either. Just openly staring while I scrolled through movie options. What? I asked without looking away from the screen. You talk to yourself while reading. I blinked. No, I don't. You just frowned at the sentence, inspired by true events. That phrase means nothing anymore. A quiet laugh. Then silence again. I glanced sideways at him finally. Seth looked calmer than I'd ever seen him. Not tense. Not carefully restrained. Just happy. And somehow that realization scared me more than anything else so far. Because this wasn't flirtation anymore. This wasn't just attraction. Something real was happening here. The plane hit a rough patch of turbulence halfway through the flight. Automatically, my hand tightened against the armrest again. Without even thinking about it, Seth's hand shifted slightly beside mine. Not grabbing. Not forcing anything. Just there. An offer. My chest tightened painfully. Very carefully, I turned my hand slightly until our fingers touched. Seth went completely still beside me. Then slowly, almost cautiously, his fingers curled lightly with mine. Warm. Steady. Certain. I stopped breathing for a second. Neither of us looked at each other. But I felt Seth exhale softly beside me like something inside him had finally unclenched. And suddenly I realized something devastating. This man had been lonely for a very long time. The thought stayed with me all the way back to the office Monday morning. Reality hit fast there. Bright lights. Emails. Coworkers everywhere. Normal life. Except nothing felt normal anymore. Olivia immediately cornered me near the coffee machine. So, she said suspiciously, how was Denver? I opened my mouth. Then Seth walked past us toward the conference room. Our eyes met briefly, and the tiny shift in his expression, softer, quieter, private, somehow sent warmth straight through me. Olivia's eyes narrowed instantly. Oh my God, she whispered. I nearly choked on coffee. What? What was that look? I don't know what you're talking about. Noah, I'm literally just standing here. You look insane right now. I fled before she could interrogate me further. The problem was, trying to act normal around Seth had become impossible. Because now I noticed him constantly. In meetings. Across hallways. Standing near my desk talking to someone else, while absent-mindedly looking for me in the room. And the worst part? Now he noticed me noticing him. Which created this unbearable loop of eye contact and tension all day. By lunchtime, I felt clinically unwell. Around 3 in the afternoon, Seth stopped beside my desk holding a folder. Professional. Composed. Except for the fact that his fingers brushed mine intentionally while handing it over. Tiny contact. Still enough to send my pulse racing immediately. You missed a signature line, he said calmly. I stared at him. You came all the way over here for one signature line. Yes. You're a terrible liar. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Then, quieter. Conference room B. 5 minutes. And just walked away. My entire nervous system short-circuited instantly. Olivia looked up from across the office. Oh, you are absolutely sleeping together. We are absolutely not. Yet, she corrected. I hated how accurate that sounded. 5 minutes later, I slipped into conference room, trying very hard to look like a man calmly attending a work discussion and not someone about to spontaneously combust. Seth was already there. Door closed. Tie loosened slightly, looking directly at me the second I walked in. The room suddenly felt too small again. You summoned me? I asked weakly. Seth exhaled slowly like he was steadying himself. We need to talk. That sentence has literally never improved anyone's day. A faint smile flickered across his face before disappearing again. Then he stepped closer. Noah, he said quietly. I meant what I said at the airport. My heartbeat immediately sped up. Okay, I answered softly. Seth looked unusually tense now, more nervous than he'd been in Denver somehow. I know this is complicated, he continued carefully, and I know we work together, but I don't want to pretend this isn't happening. Neither did I. That was the problem. Because standing there looking at him now, I realized the terrifying truth. I'd gotten used to Seth being part of my day frighteningly fast. His attention, his quiet observations, the way he looked at me like I was something important, and I didn't want to lose it. I don't want to pretend either, I admitted. Something vulnerable flashed across his expression, then relief maybe. Then Seth laughed softly under his breath. What? I asked. You know what's humiliating? He murmured. What? I had an entire plan for this conversation. I grinned immediately. You made a plan? Several. That is the most attractive thing you've ever said to me. He covered his eyes briefly with one hand. You are impossible. And yet, he repeated quietly. The room fell silent again. Not awkward, just full of everything neither of us quite knew how to say yet. Then Seth looked at me for a long second before asking softly, would it be inappropriate if I asked you to dinner? Warmth spread instantly through my chest. I smiled before I could stop myself. Seth, I said quietly, I think we're way past inappropriate. Our first real date happened 3 days later. Not because Seth wanted to wait. Because apparently the man approached romance like a classified military operation. We should pick somewhere discreet, he'd said Monday evening over text. Me. Are we having an affair or eating pasta? Seth. Both potentially. I stared at my phone for a full minute after that message because Seth Kane having dry humor over text felt deeply unfair to my emotional stability. By Thursday night, I was pacing around my apartment trying to decide if I looked too dressed up. Which was ridiculous. It was just Seth. Except now just Seth meant. The man who remembered my coffee order, held my hand during turbulence, and looked at me like saying my name actually mattered. So yeah, I changed shirts 3 times. The restaurant Seth picked was small and dimly lit, and absolutely the kind of place someone researches for 2 hours beforehand. You planned this, I accused immediately after sitting down. His expression remained perfectly neutral. I selected a location. You selected candles. They came with the table. Liar. That finally made him smile. God. Every time Seth smiled now, it felt like winning something. Dinner itself should have been awkward. Technically, this was our first actual date after months of mutual emotional repression and workplace hostility. Instead, it felt weirdly easy. Like we'd already skipped past the small talk stage somewhere between Denver and the airport confession. We talked for hours. Not about work this time. Real things. Seth told me about growing up with parents who valued perfection over feelings. About always being the quiet, smart one. About learning early that emotions were easier to manage privately. I wasn't good at people, he admitted quietly over his wine glass. I looked at him carefully. You're good with me. The way his expression softened after that nearly destroyed me. You make that easier than it should be, he said. And there it was again. That terrifying sincerity. So I told him things too. About how exhausting it was always being the funny one. How people assumed confidence meant nothing could hurt you. How sometimes I joked just to stay in control of conversations. Seth listened the entire time without interrupting once. Completely focused. Completely present. Nobody had ever listened to me like that before. At one point I caught him staring again. What? I asked, smiling slightly. His gaze held mine for another second before he answered honestly. You're different outside work. So are you. A faint smile. Fair. The waiter brought dessert neither of us ordered because apparently Seth had quietly arranged that too. I pointed immediately. This is date behavior. You are currently on a date. You know what I mean. Seth actually looked slightly embarrassed, which only made this better for me emotionally. You planned dessert, I said, delighted. You're making this difficult. You're secretly romantic. This is catastrophic information. His eyes flicked downward briefly while smiling. And suddenly the warmth between us shifted again. Softer, closer, more dangerous. By the time we stepped outside afterward, the city streets were mostly quiet. Cold air hit immediately. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets. Okay, so winter should actually be illegal. You say that every time the temperature drops below 60. Because I believe it passionately. Seth laughed softly beside me. Then, after a second, his hand brushed lightly against mine while we walked. Tentative, like he was asking. My chest tightened painfully. I turned my hand immediately, fingers sliding carefully with his. Seth went quiet beside me. Not surprised. More like affected. Deeply affected. And honestly, same. We walked half a block like that before I realized something. You know, I murmured. This is probably the nicest anyone's ever been to me. Seth stopped walking. I immediately regretted saying it because vulnerability after 9 p.m. should legally require supervision. But Seth was looking at me now with that same unbearably careful expression he got whenever I accidentally admitted something real. Noah, he said softly. I laughed weakly. Ignore me. I'm having emotions in public. Embarrassing. I'm not ignoring that. Of course he wasn't. Because Seth noticed everything. He stepped a little closer on the sidewalk, still holding my hand. You deserve to be treated carefully, he said quietly. The sincerity in his voice hit me so hard I actually had to look away for a second. God, this man was going to ruin me completely. You really mean things when you say them, huh? I asked softly. Yes. No hesitation. No performance. Just truth. And suddenly I understood why falling for Seth felt so intense. Because he didn't love halfway. Probably couldn't. When he cared about something, he gave it his full attention. And somehow, impossibly, terrifyingly, he was giving that attention to me. We ended up outside my apartment building eventually. Neither of us seemed eager to end the night. Seth stood close enough that I could feel warmth through his coat sleeves. You know, I said carefully, for someone who spent months avoiding eye contact with me, you're doing surprisingly well right now. A quiet smile touched his mouth. I'm still nervous. Seriously? You're still Noah? That did something awful to my heartbeat. I smiled helplessly. You are so gone for me. Yes, he said softly. I think I am. Direct hit. Immediate emotional collapse. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Then Seth reached up carefully, brushing his fingers lightly against my jaw the same way he had in Denver. Gentle. Intentional. You should go upstairs, he murmured quietly. You saying that for my benefit or yours? A pause. Both. I laughed softly under my breath. Then I leaned in first this time. And the look on Seth's face right before we kissed, surprised, relieved, overwhelmed all at once, was the exact moment I realized something irreversible. The man who used to make me nervous at work had somehow become the safest thing in my life.